Today we're going to talk about corporation stops and meter valves, those Section A and Section G of the Ford catalog. We're going to combine them both because actually both have a lot of the same characteristics when they're manufactured and when they're in use. I'll start and go through corporation stops, and once I give you all the information on that, then we'll go on to meter valves. You know, when I was a Ford meter box representative, I always wondered where the term came from, Ford corporation stop, you know. The first story I heard was that the water company, the water corporation, always owned the main line. And so when a customer wanted to hook up to it, you had to incorporate your service line to the main line. So since you were hooking up your service line to the water company's line, the corporation's line, the term corporation stop came about. That's the first story I heard. The second story is very similar, but it had to do with incorporating your service line to the main line, kind of make it one integral part. A corporation stop is used as a shutoff valve at the main line. Most of the time, the corporation stop is going to remain open 100% of the time, its whole lifetime. Very seldom will a contractor or a utility go back and dig to the corp stop. The reason for that is because once you put the corp in and extend your service line to the meter box, people normally pave or put lawn, landscape, whatever. It'd be too expensive to go around digging up pavement and somebody else's yard. So normally the corp stops always stay on. There are two types of corporation stops made. There are the inverted key corp and a ball corp. They both look very similar, but they do have some subtle differences. The inverted key corp is called that because it is just that. It has an inverted key on the inside. I'll take it apart to show you how it works. This is a cone-shaped key that goes into a cone-shaped opening. Obviously, it can only go in there in one direction. Now, when they assemble these together at the plant, generally they'll put some lubrication on the cone, insert it into the key, and then put a lock washer on there and a nut to hold it on there. Generally, these things are tightened at the plant to 35 foot-pounds. When they tighten to 35 foot-pounds, they'll scribe or they'll ping the material so that the nut will stay in place and won't either counter-rotate and come off. But many times people out in the field will want to tighten that nut just to make sure that it's snug. And what happens when you over-tighten is you pull that cone-shaped plug in towards the valve, and brass being soft, you could create a leak on the back side or the inlet side of the key itself. So make sure you tell your customers that it doesn't need tightening. Just leave it as is, insert it as is. If the nut is loose, then get a torque wrench, tighten it to 75 foot-pounds. Now I mentioned the lubrication on the cone. This lubrication is obviously designed to make it easy to turn. But if you take this corporation stop and you put it in service and you let it sit for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and you try and go back and open it, that lubricant takes a set. It's like concrete. It is extremely difficult to open. So be careful, if your customers are going to go back, that they don't dislodge the key itself and cause a leak. These corporation stops, these inverted key or plug corps as they're called, are rated by a WWWL1 to 100 psi. Anything from 3/4 up to 1 inch, 100 psi. That's all it will take. If you take 1.5 inch or a 2-inch plug corp, that's only rated at 80 psi. That's extremely important to remember and to let your customers know. Now for higher pressures, Ford meter box makes a ball corp. Basically, it looks very much like the other one. It's got a rounder body. It's got wrench flats like the other one did. But inside, it has a Teflon-coated brass valve. It's got 4 mils of Teflon on it, and it sits between a gasket seal on the back side and on the front side. So you've got a Teflon-coated ball kind of floating in between two rubber seals, which makes it extremely easy to turn. With this particular corp, we like to say that the higher the water pressure, the better the seal. The reason for that is we've got a Teflon coated ball floating between two gasket or rubber seals. The higher the water pressure that goes from the main line into the corp, the harder it's going to push that ball in onto the seal on the opposite side. So the higher the pressure, the better the seal. This particular corpse can be used in applications up to 300 psi, and that's working line pressure. Working line pressure, 300 psi. How can you tell the difference between a plug corp and a ball corp? You've already seen some of the subtle differences, but the plug corp is a plug style fitting and the ball corp is a ball style fitting. One designed for lower pressures, one designed for higher pressures. Now these two come or are made with different inlet threads. One is a male iron pipe thread that can be threaded into the saddle. A male iron pipe thread from Ford generally comes with a blue cap, and the threads are parallel to one another. The CC thread or taper thread comes with a red cap, and the threads are tapered, or they come cone shaped, or they come to a point. In ball valves, this is pretty much true as well. We have an inverted key valve. This is a take-apart valve, that's why it looks different than what we see on the shelf, but it's got a larger pin so that I can pull it out, and I'll do that now. This is an inverted key valve because it has a cone-shaped cone that goes into a cone-shaped opening, and it can only go in there one way. The same thing applies to these inverted key valves. When you put lubricant on here at assembly and drive it in there and put the cap on, if you leave that key valve in operation for over a period of a year, 2 years, 3 years, and you go back and try and turn it, it's going to turn extremely hard because the lubricant will take a set. This is one reason why we see a lot of breakage out in the field. Customers, not the utility workers, not the contractors necessarily, but customers will go out there and try and shut off their own water, and when they reach the stop that's built into the valve to begin with, they'll keep on turning because the plug valve turns so very hard after it's been in application. Of all waterworks brass is again specified by WWWL1, and it states that the material should be 85% brass, 5% lead, 5% tin, and 5% zinc. Now, brass is a soft material. We add 5% lead to make it a little bit softer and more malleable. We can form it then. The tin, the 5% tin, is used to give it tensile strength. And the zinc is what I like to call the glue that holds it all together. It's kind of the glue of the whole formula. Today there are people talking about lead-free brass, which is another issue we won't address now, but you know, that is an upcoming issue and you should be aware of it. Your customers will be asking you about lead-free brass. Can we supply it? Can we not? The iron pipe threads will always be smaller than the AWWA threads. This is an iron pipe thread saddle. The iron pipe thread fits right in perfectly. The AWWA or CC threads are much larger. There's no way you're going to get that in there. Again, make sure that when you're filling out an order, it's in the right saddle with the right part. Otherwise, we're going to have problems out in the field. The angled ball valve or ball valve, it can be any configuration, angled or straight through. It's much like the ball corp. It's rated for higher pressure use, and it's made up pretty much the same way as the corp. You've got a Teflon coated ball, 4 mils of Teflon, between two rubber seals. A seal that sits in the back of the fitting and a seal that sits in front of the fitting. Again, the ball valve, which comes in different configurations, it can be a straight through valve like this one, it can be an angle, is designed for higher working pressures. This will also take 300 psi. Working pressure, that's working pressure in all sizes. The plug valve will take 100 psi up to 1 inch and 80 psi, 1.25 inches and higher. Now both of these fittings will come with different outlet connections. The most common in the old days was copper flare, which we still provide. Some people still use that. This is a copper flare fitting. The thing about flaring copper is that it's a little more time consuming. Copper flaring takes a little bit more time than a compression fitting. For a copper flare to be successful, you have to make sure that the copper is cut squarely, number one. Number two, you have to deburr it. Many times the burrs that are left on after the cut on copper will split and thereby create a leak. So you have to be very, very careful that the cut is square, that it's deburred, and then you have to flare it. So it's a little bit more time consuming. Copper flaring is actually a lost art today. There aren't many people in our industry that can correctly flare copper tubing. You can also get the corbs and these valves with pack joints on them. I think we're all pretty familiar with pack joints. Pretty much a two-part fitting. You tighten the nut, and I think the rule was hand tight and a quarter turn with a wrench, and then you set the set screw. Again, those are two processes. People thought that this was too slow and they wanted something that would be a little bit faster. Consequently, Ford came up with what they call the grip joint, which consisted of a nut and 3 other pieces. This were way too many pieces for our customers. There's too many pieces to get lost, especially if you're in a ditch. If it's raining, if there's water in the ditch, you drop this thing, you're going to lose parts. So it's not the most popular, but there are some people out there who prefer it. A word of caution on grip joint. When you tighten this nut down onto the fitting, obviously the copper is in the nut. When you tighten this down, this ring will grip the copper fitting. One of the problems you could encounter using this fitting is that this gripper ring will adhere to the copper tubing so tight it actually becomes part of the tubing, because the ring is soft enough that it will embed itself into the nut itself. Consequently, if you get a roll of copper, you assemble this fitting together, you get a roll of copper and you roll it out with this nut already pre-tightened as tight as you can get, which is how you're supposed to tighten this, and you drop the copper tubing counterclockwise, it will actually loosen the nut. The weight of the copper will torque the tubing and it will actually loosen the nut. Now that doesn't happen very often, but it is something that has happened out in the field. You got to be aware of it, be careful with it. The latest fitting that Ford has come up with, and you can get with your corp stops and or meter valves, is the quick joint, which is basically a copy of the Mueller 110. The quick joint basically has 2 parts, the nut and a gasket with a metal ring embedded into the gasket. So they simplified it somewhat. This is actually a very good seal. The gasket inside the nut is designed to rotate. So if you had the same scenario where you drop the roll of copper counterclockwise, the only thing that would move would be the gasket inside would rotate. It wouldn't affect the seal at all in any way, shape, or form. The quick joint. These 4 types of connections you can also get on a corp stop or a ball valve. If your service line is polyethylene or polybutylene, you may want or elect to use stiffeners. That is so that the pipe will give the fitting something to bite on. The problem with stiffeners, or a word of caution on stiffeners, is make sure that they're the correct length and the correct OD for your service line. If the insert fitting sticks out too far and you are using polyethylene or butylene and you get ground shift, the sharp edge of the insert could easily shear off your service line. That has happened many times with people using the wrong size insert. The insert should be inside the fitting itself all the way so that there is no shear action to it. So we've covered some of the similarities and the subtle differences of the corporation stops, both the plug style and the ball style, and meter valves, both the plug style and the ball style. When ordering a corporation stop from the catalog or from memory, please be sure that you understand and realize that they both use the same numbering system. The only difference is that a plug corp will always be designated by the letter F, and a ball corp will always be designated by the letters FB. That's the only difference. The rest of the number will be the same. So you have to be extremely careful when ordering corporation stops. On the valves themselves, on these angle valves, obviously one was designated just as a V for a valve. That's the plug valve. The other one will be BV for ball valve. In review, please remember 85-555 brass material, a plug, a cone-shaped key, a ball, a Teflon coated ball between two gaskets. Remember the threads, iron pipe thread as opposed to CC or taper thread. Remember the working pressures, plug, corps, and valves, 100 psi up to 1 inch, 80 psi, 1.25 inches and higher. On ball valves, always 300 psi, not a problem. Also remember the designation for the type threads. Blue being iron pipe thread, red being CC or taper thread. Remember to use the correct length and size of inserts. Remember to use the right size saddle. And remember the 4 different types of connections you can get these fittings in. Copper flare, pack joint, grip joint, and quick joint or Q joint as we call it. And remember, everything that we've talked about so far, corporation stops and meter valves, are found in sections A and sections G of the Ford catalog.